Yes, we are live. It's Life on Purpose Live coming to you this afternoon. I'm sure where Dr. Glenn Daman is, it's cold because he's coming from Washington State and I'm cold in Louisiana. So hopefully we can bring you a warm message. Welcome, Glenn. We're glad to have you.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm so glad to have you. We have so many things we can talk about. So you are coming to us from Washington. So it's fun to talk across, far away. But is it cold there?
Actually, today it's not too bad. It's above freezing, so no
Yeah,
snow, so that's good.
yeah, yeah. Well, congratulations on your new book. You've written several books, but you have a new book out now. And as an author, I know how tough that can be. But The Lighthouse has come out, and it's about encouraging people in confusing times. So let's kind of talk about that because you've been a pastor for many years. I think 35 years. You're an expert in leadership and building teams and small groups, and but you also have a rural perspective um, and small church understanding, and that's kind of the bread and butter of our nation. So, what are the trends that you're seeing as a pastor to other pastors and congregations?
Well, I think in terms of rural ministry, one of the biggest things that we're facing in rural ministry is that the crisis of what we think about in terms of inner city uh, and the characteristics that you find in the inner city with chronic poverty, drug issues, the whole host of things, that's becoming the reality of rural America today. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really facing a challenge for the rural church to kind of rethink how it does ministry, to do it in a way that ministers to people's needs, to address those kind of issues. So rural America is changing very quickly, and that's going to
Well,
be a
I'm sure it
challenge.
is. So, that when we think about that, we think of out in the country, and we think of small churches with families and things like that. So that's it's unaffected by being out in the country or off the beaten path, so to speak, because these problems that you're saying that are universal to inner cities are reaching inner cities. And how is that? How do you see that coming into sneaking out down the pretty little roads to what you would consider otherwise, kind of out in the middle of, what you would consider to be safe?
Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is rural America is facing a struggle economically with job opportunities, those kind of things. And then what is happening is the drug market is seeing one opportunities in rural areas, but then also a place to manufacture in rural communities. So,
Mm-hmm.
one of the big things in rural areas is the opioid addiction and the opioid problem that really stems from the difference between rural America and inner city is rural America, that drug addiction stems from pain management. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
they do physical work, and as a result of that, they get hurt, but they still need to go to work. A farmer's still got to go out there. And so then they start taking oxycodone and those kind of pain management, and they get addicted to it. And so that becomes a major problem for the rural communities. And then they lack resources to help those individuals deal with that. And so that's where it becomes a challenge to the church, because the church is really on the front lines of that and one of the major resources available to help people in rural communities.
And
So,
how do you help someone? Say someone comes into your church and you're the pastor and you don't have a big team of counseling center people and you don't have, the resources of a big bunch of people right down the street that can help. How do you advise someone, say their child is on drugs or their spouse has gotten addicted to painkillers? I mean, what are the things that you can do that we can learn from that would help someone in a similar situation?
Well, it really goes back to just relationships. And
Yeah.
it is a challenge for small church pastors because they haven't had the training oftentimes in those kind of areas. But really, just being there one on one, being there as a friend to help them walk through it, helping them to connect with resources that are available. Uh, but it just goes back to the gospel and just helping
Yeah.
people realize the power of the gospel in their life and the transformation of that.
Yeah.
And so uh, it is a challenge. It is puts pressure, and pastors get discouraged. But there is opportunities for ministry
Yeah.
just by refocusing people's heart upon God and recognizing Him.
And so, what's happening to the smaller churches? Have you seen a lot of decline in churches closing? I think I read about that. And is there an opportunity for churches to work together to try to form an alliance together to help on a wider scale?
Well, the rural areas weren't as impacted from COVID as many other communities, and part of that, rural churches are very resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they don't have a lot of funds, and so that struggle financially. But as far as their resiliency, they've existed for many years. They're a close knit community. There's a strong bond in that community of the church. And so as a result of that, they can kind of withstand some of the external pressures
Mm-hmm.
that come. But having said that, there is also, I think, there's opportunities for more rural evangelism
Mm-hmm.
because rural communities are not reached with the gospel as we think they are. We tend to think of rural areas as they've already been reached with the gospel. So we need to focus our attention elsewhere. But the reality is, rural America is conservative. They're religious, uh, but there's not a true transformation of Christ. And so there's opportunities for church planning. I think there's opportunities for churches to work together for outreach. Um, and the good news is there's some of that going on today, that there has been a change in recognizing the need for more rural ministry
Mm-hmm.
in denominations and in kind of the general church population, so to speak. But so that's given, I think, more awareness of rural ministry. I think the
Yeah.
challenge for rural ministry is finding pastors that are willing to go out into these forgotten places and minister where they're not going to get recognition. They're not going to get their name out there, but they can still have an impact with the gospel.
Yeah. That's an interesting perspective because, with social media and things like that, it is so easy to get caught up in that. But so let's talk about the confusing times that we're in. Um, whether you're in a rural community or a big town, you look out into the world and you're like, oh my gosh, somebody fix it, and
Yeah.
you just want to stick your head under a pillow and come back out when everything's gone back to normal, and that's just not going to happen. So, in your book Lighthouse, you talk about the characteristics of God, and the is what do you say to people who look out into the world and they think there's nothing I can do to help, but there is things we can do, and some of that is digging deep into our faith. So what do you add to that as far as encouraging others?
Well, I always say that whenever you look at the world and it looks like you can't get any more crazy, someone accepts the challenge.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and we look at our world today, and we live in a broken world. We live in a
Mhm.
world that is increasingly abandoning its Judeo-Christian ethic. But we look at it as a moral problem. We look at it as a social problem. But the
Mhm.
reality is, it's really a theological problem. It's our view of God and who God is. And the challenge I think we face in our Christian life is that we oftentimes kind of dissect and disengage from our understanding of God, and we kind of pick and choose rather than recognizing that we have a God who is so incredibly, he's not only incredibly loving, but he's what I like to say, he's incredibly big. You know, that when we look at the challenges we face in our Christian life, our God is so much bigger than we envision. I think one of the challenges we face is in terms of the immensity of God. You know, the Bible says that he measures the span of the universe, or measures the universe with the span of his hand. Well, you know, the latest telescope has identified the furthest star out there as being 28 billion light years away.
Yeah.
You know, and we can't wrap our minds around that. And so, you know, I look at it and, you know, 7 times around the earth in 1 second, that's the speed of light. Now multiply that by 28 billion years.
Yeah.
And then he says he measures it with the span of his hand. So in light of that, how, you know, we get so caught up into the struggles we face in life, and we fail to recognize, you know, God is so much in control. He is so much bigger than this. We don't need to worry. He's got it taken care of. And that's a problem, because as finite individuals, to grasp our mind around an infinite God, what do? We tend to make God finite. We make him bigger than us, but we fail to recognize that he is infinitely more, and his perspective is different than ours. Our perspective is governed by the present. You know, we're governed by what's here and now. He looks at life and everything from an eternal perspective. And from that perspective, which we can't see, he sees the end, and he knows, okay, how is this going to affect the end? How are the events of today going to have an eternal impact? And that's where we struggle, rather than just saying, okay, I can trust God for that, to do that.
And I think people trust the far off better than they do the day to day. It's like, okay, God, what do I do right now today? And he is a right now today God. So what do you say to someone who's really wrestling with the daily decisions of bills and economy and jobs and things like that? Because, you know, a lot of people right now aren't thinking real long term. They're just thinking about the next paycheck or the next month of bills. So what do you tell someone when they're trying to really wrestle with, and I know one of the topics you talk about is God's provision. What do you tell someone who's wrestling with that on how to trust God with that, and then see through the trial of, you know, the right now moment?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, we're all there. I mean, there's not a single one of us, you know, that, you know, I think like Paul, where he says, we see through a glass darkly, you know, and he says that, you know, these things I do, I press on to know him and to be found in him. But, you know, we're still in a journey. We still struggle with that. And we're not fully going to get it until we get to heaven. And that's why I look forward to heaven, is finally saying, I get it.
Yeah.
But in terms of the present and realizing that, we live in a fallen world where it is broken. That's the reality that we face. But God gives us that perspective and that assurance that he's going to be there with us every step of the way, even though we don't see it, even though we don't feel it at times. That he promises that he's going to be with us. He's guiding us. He's orchestrating the events. And I look at the struggles that we face in life, and God is not the cause of evil. Okay, we know that, but he's the orchestrator of things, and we can trust him when Paul says all things work together for good. He doesn't say all things are good. He says all things work together for good. That God is accomplishing that, and he's orchestrating these events in our life, and he's promises he's going to take care of us and provide for us. That doesn't mean he's going to give us what we want. That doesn't mean he's going to give us a life of ease. But it really goes back to our theology. And I think that's why we struggle today in our Christian life, is because we have become focused on what God does for us rather than who God is. And we need to reorient to who he is.
Yeah. Well, and the culture is so pushing, it's all about me. And, if you want to, you should, and all of that. But we've got to get back to the ways of God, to know the will of God. And sometimes people don't want to take the time to do that. Because, it goes back to in the moment, the culture says, oh, you get to do whatever you want to do. But, we end up costing our own selves by our own decisions oftentimes, what God could have done when we step out away from, what we know to be the wisdom of his way. So does that make sense? I mean, it's wisdom, but it's also fighting that cultural push to, it's all about you, me.
Yeah. Well, and that gets back to the wisdom of God. When we talk about the wisdom of God and the knowledge of God, the knowledge of God means that God knows all things from eternity past. He knows all things present, all things future. He knows all possible options, and he knows all possible conclusions from every possible option. Okay, so that's his knowledge. Then his wisdom is that he then picks the perfect way. We don't have that because we don't have infinite knowledge. So we look at options, we pick the option that we think is best, but oftentimes it plays out that it's not. That's not true of God. Everything he does is based upon his infinite ability to say, okay, I know the outcome. I know the outcome of every option, and this is the option that has the perfect outcome. So this is the option that I can take. So, and that's true in suffering, that God has a purpose for suffering. That suffering is not just arbitrary, but he's working and utilizing it in our life to accomplish his purpose. And that purpose will ultimately be good. And so that's why when he says all things work together for good, it's the outcome that he looks at, where we look at the event that we're going through.
So let's talk about purpose. I'm an author, and my book is called Life on Purpose. And I'm a big believer that, intention, choosing wise things based on, a proper assessment of your options and things like that. Because I have hit so many brick walls because I made bad decisions. So now I'm like, okay, how can I make better decisions? So purpose, when we look at the world and we think, oh my gosh, everything's so broken. God put us here. He loves the world. He so loved the world that he gave Jesus. So how do we look at the world and instead of seeing problems, see purpose and go out and do something about those problems?
Well, that's the challenge. And that's the interplay, I think, between God's sovereignty and his control, that sovereignty is not fatalism. Fatalism is that God's going to do what he's going to do, and it doesn't matter what we do. So any action on our part is pointless. But when we look at God's sovereignty, it does not preclude human responsibility or activity. And, that interchange, we don't fully understand. I mean, that gets back to the whole debate of Calvinism and Arminianism. And I say, we'll figure that out when we get to heaven, because we're never going to figure it out now. But he has this plan that he's sovereign, but yet he also engages us in the process. And so that when we look at the problems of our culture today, we don't, whether it's the economic problems, the drug issues, social justice issues, all these different things, he's called it upon us to be the salt of the earth, to be of influence. to
Mhm.
look at opportunities and say, how can we manifest Christ in those opportunities? But it has to
Mhm.
be done in the context of his character. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes as Christians, we react based upon our perception rather than react based upon what is God's character, and how does that guide and influence what we do and how we engage our culture today.
Yeah. Yeah. That I think that's well said, because we do tend to put the emphasis on what we think and what we feel in response to the problem, but instead pray to God and say, Lord, I see a bunch of problems out here. What can I do to help them? And then listen, because as you talk about the presence of God, He is with us, and He is through the Holy Spirit. He will answer those questions, and He will give us, you know, the path to purpose that's specific to us if we ask Him instead of everybody but Him.
Yeah, and also looking at it and saying, okay, I can't solve national problems,
Hmm.
you know,
Right.
but what can I deal with in my specific sphere of influence?
Hmm.
How can I have the impact within this sphere?
Yeah.
Uh, if you're in a small town, in a small community, how can you impact that community? If you're in a large town, or you're in a position of leadership uh, that has a broader influence, how can we use that and leverage what God has given us and placed us to use it to have that impact,
Hmm.
to affect people around us. And so many times I think as Christians we kind of throw our hands up and we say, well, I can't, the world and our culture is going rapidly downhill and I can't do anything to stop it. And we can one person at a time.
Yeah. And
That we
part of that is sharing our stories.
Yeah,
And, if you can't convince someone to believe in the Bible, you can convince them what God has done in your life, which will lead them to perhaps opening up the Bible. I believe that's how we change the world, one story at a time, and that's incredible, and an incredible opportunity for us to share our faith.
yeah, and that's when we go through suffering, uh, that's what God's using to equip us to then effectively minister to other people.
Hmm. Yeah.
Who can best minister to someone who's facing a tragedy than the person that's already gone through that tragedy?
Right.
Because they can come along and say, I've been there. I know what it's like. Let me tell you how God has given me strength
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah. That's well said. So you have several books. Your most recent one is the Lighthouse. You have several other books. One I would like to ask about, and it's When Shepherds Weep. We don't think about pastors weeping very often, and you are a pastor, but the
Mhm.
weight of the world is on the shoulders of those that lead us. What do you say to people that, we really want to come alongside our local churches and our pastors and be of assistance and help and purpose, because that is a hard role to play in today's world. I mean, the statistics and everything is up against the church. I mean, people are leaving in mass exodus. So they say, if you listen to all the news, how do we help our pastors?
First of all, just love them.
Yeah.
Recognize that they are sinful, fallen individuals. That uh, people ask me, what is the hardest thing about being a pastor? And they always say, it must be so hard to deal with people's problems. And I always say, the hardest thing for me in being a pastor is myself,
Mm.
is my own sinfulness. And that's the tension that we face in ministry. Is every Sunday we get up and we're preaching, and there are times we're preaching on things that we know that we're not applying in our own life,
Yeah.
that we're struggling. And recognizing that pastors are human, and so that we don't put false expectations on them, that
Hmm.
somehow they should be super saints that never get angry, never get frustrated, never get discouraged. uh, and so I think that's where it's the most important thing we can do to encourage pastors. And then the other thing is just helping them in ministry. Don't expect them to do everything. They're there to equip saints for the work of ministry. One of the things that excite me most is when I see lay people, take the initiative, and they always come up and say, "Is it okay if I do this?" It's like, yes, go for it.
Yeah.
That brings me great joy. And but recognize that pastors are facing an incredible amount of pressure today. The pressure for success, the pressure for them to be perfect, the pressure for them to measure up to kind of this idealistic view that we develop through the media, that the pastor should be like that person on the mass media. And, we're just human beings that just love the Lord and are called. And I believe that I'm called to minister. I can do nothing else. But that we still face our own human frailty, and just how can they support that? And that's the most important thing. Just love them.
And I think what you said is so true, is not expect them to be like Superman or Superwoman, because they are imperfect people like the rest of us. And, they feel the weight of all those expectations, I'm sure. And that's tough. That's really tough. So your books, what's the best way for people to get the Lighthouse and your other books? You have many other books. And if anybody has questions about rural ministry, you're like an expert in that, plus also the character of God. You write about that. You've been in ministry for a long time. You're a doctor for a reason. You've really studied this. So if people wanted to get in touch with you or your books, the best way is through your website?
Probably the best way would be just to go on Amazon. They're all available on Amazon. Just type in my name and the title of the book. And so that would probably be the best way. I mean, certainly they can go on my website and kind of see what's available, but they're all available through any of the major book outlets that you can order books from.
Well, that's good. That's good. Well, it's been great talking to you and hearing about what you're doing. And, small town and rural America is so important. So it's good to know there's pastors like you out there working within the small churches in the small towns and building up the people, because that's, if for those of us in big towns, we're, it's such a good thing to know you're doing.
Well, I grew up on a farm, and I always say that there's several reasons I didn't become a pastor of a large church. One is they didn't want me, but two, nobody would understand my farm stories. So, I have to stay rural in order to keep my stories so people can understand them.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, I sure am glad you're doing what you're doing, and I wish you well on your book. I hope that it is a big success, and congratulations on it. And we'll keep in touch and loop back around and do this again. And so, Dr. Glenn Daman, we thank you so much for being with us today. Have a great day, and we'll hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.